Hello, 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 and welcome back to yet another college football video. Man, it's the top 15 and it's getting good, man. It's starting to get down to teams where it's like, damn, like they could really win the national championship here. So I'm excited, man. Let's get right into it, man. Thank you for watching. I'm not gonna hold y'all up for too long. All right, let's quickly recap what we've been through so far. Number 30 through 20, those are my playoff long shots. Um, I expect only about one of those teams to make the playoff, probably a G5 team, the highest rated G5 team. So probably either Liberty or maybe Memphis or Tulane or something like that. The second tier we had was the very good teams. These are teams where I think they could make a run at their conference championship. And I think one or maybe two of those teams could make the college football playoff. Uh, we're gonna get into the contenders tier here, okay? I think three or maybe even four of these teams right here could make the playoff. Four out of seven. That's a lot. And my top six, I expect all of those to be in the playoffs and contending for a national championship. All right, man. Without further ado, let's get into the first team I got on here. Number 13, we got LSU. LSU, man. Look, Brian Kelly has been there for 2 years, right? And in those 2 seasons, he started off 20-7. Okay. Back to back double digit win seasons. But now he has a lot of heavy lifting to do because he's trying to replace his Heisman QB. I think his Bolitnikov, or no, I think Marv won the Bolitnikov, but arguably should have been two Bolitnikov caliber receivers. And on top of all that, he's trying to stack together his third straight 10-win season at LSU. So he has a lot on his plate while trying to replace some pretty good NFL level talent. Let's get into what they were last season. Last season, LSU was the best offense in the country. They led the entire country in yards and points per game. They were top 10 in passing and rushing. It's that's almost unfathomable that the same team was able to do that. They didn't turn the ball over. It was really a perfect offense, honestly. You know, defensively though is where they saw the majority of their issues, I'd say. It's kind of expected, usually the teams that are the best and the most explosive and they score the fastest, they're usually not good in terms of stopping the pass because other teams, they get so many more possessions and they're having to throw the ball more often to catch up. But LSU was also bad against the run. And they didn't get that many sacks considering how often the opposing team was passing, and they didn't take the ball away. So they were really garbage across the board defensively. And that's why, thankfully, their defensive coordinator is no longer their defensive coordinator. He went to the Jaguars. So, yeah, thankfully for LSU, they got a new DC in there, and hopefully he should be able to fix some of the massive problems they had last season, namely not using Harold Perkins as a pass rusher. They tried to make Harold Perkins into a stand-up linebacker, which is, yeah, it's no wonder why that guy is no longer a defensive coordinator. Here is the roster we're looking at here. The top thing I need to point your attention to would be Garrett Nussmeier taking over at quarterback here. Here's the thing. He's not some brand new guy, and he's also not a transfer guy. He's a guy who's been at LSU for a while now. This is his fourth year. He's played in 18 games over his first 3 seasons. So he's ready, man. He's been there. He knows the system. He probably knows all of these players that are still remaining. So I for all the new quarterbacks and I guess you could say first year quarterbacks like that have never been starters before, Garrett Nussmeier, he might be near the top of that. He might even be at the top of that list, to be honest, because what I like is the experience in how long he's been in the system. Um, Here's the thing though about the run game. They lost their top two rushers, one of which being Jaden Daniels, the other being Logan Diggs. He left to Ole Miss, I believe. Josh Williams is going to be the number one there, and he wasn't bad last season, but do I want Josh Williams to be my only option? Because remember, we're going from a quarterback who had over 1,000 rushing yards to a guy who's more of a pocket passer. So their running numbers are going to drop dramatically. They're going to have to throw the ball so much more than they did last season. But here's the thing, though. I look at their receiving core, And I actually like it a lot here. So you replace Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas with CJ Daniels, who was a stud at Liberty. He had over 1,000 yards, 10 touchdowns, and nearly 20 yards per reception. That's CJ Daniels. That's their new number one receiver. You also got Xavier Thomas coming in from Mississippi State. Remember how bad Mississippi State was last season offensively? He had over 500 yards there. So I think he's a guy who, in an improved system with more touches, could really, up his production through the roof. You bring back Kyron Lacey, who was your wide receiver three last season, and I could certainly see him taking a big jump in terms of production. So I love what you have with your top three receivers. You got your certified number one in CJ Daniels, and you got multiple guys in Xavier Thomas and Kyron Lacey who you expect to take jumps. And honestly, their top three receivers, they get a thumbs up from me. I really like what I'm seeing in terms of their pass game. And let's not forget about Mason Taylor, who has already made some really big plays during his time at LSU, and he returns now for yet another season. So honestly, if we're just going from a straight, from a very dynamic run and pass offense to a more pass heavy, pass dominant system, I don't mind that. I think Garrett Nussmeier could do really well because he has all the weapons he needs. So I'm actually excited to see how LSU looks offensively because I think there's still going to be a high-powered offense here. Defensively, like I said, new DC, it really can't get much worse, to be honest with you. Harold Perkins is the key here for me. They lost a couple guys to the NFL. Their secondary was so bad last season. They need help there. They only bring in one transfer portal player, which I don't love. Well, they brought in several, but only one who's projected to be a starter. Harold Perkins is the key here. If you just let this man line up on the defensive line every single play, let him go after opposing quarterbacks, I'm sure he can wreak havoc and he can single handedly win you games like he did in 2022. LSU needs to get back to that if they want hopes of being even a respectable defense. Taking a look at their schedule here, all three of their losses came against teams that finished in like the top 6 or 7, I believe. Okay, Ole Miss, Florida State, Alabama. Honestly, there's no shame in losing to those three teams. And Ole Miss and Alabama, those games were incredibly close. Remember, Alabama, it was neck and neck until Jaden Daniels went down with a concussion, I believe. Um, and looking at next season here, but well, let's go back to besides those three teams, they dominated. Texas A&M double digits, Georgia State blew out, Florida State double digits, or Florida, sorry, double digits. Army blew out, Auburn blew out, Missouri. That's a great win over Missouri, a really good Missouri team. Arkansas close win, Missouri or Mississippi State blew out, Grambling State blew out. So they took care of business and even had some really good wins in there. But the top of their comp, they lost the three toughest opponents they played with a Heisman. So they play four of my top 30 next season. Um, Ole Miss, A&M, Alabama, and Oklahoma. But here's the thing about that right there. Three of their toughest games, the three toughest games, Alabama, Ole Miss, and Oklahoma, they're all at home. So if you had to break that down, I'd say that's a pretty good break for LSU there. Um, and 10-2. This is the thing with this schedule, because even think about the teams that aren't in my top 30 that they would get a lot of credit for if they beat USC, UCLA, uh, Florida. Like with this schedule, 10-2 could very possibly lead to a playoff berth, depending on how it ends up. Like if they win those, like let's say they lose to Ole Miss, but they win those last 6 games, including wins over Bama and Oklahoma, how are you going to keep them out of the playoff? Or even if they lose to Alabama, right? But you beat Ole Miss, or it's like they could really shake this up here. And it's a tough schedule. It's an SEC schedule. Even their non-SEC games are UCLA and USC, right? So it's not an easy schedule by any means. However, outside of the Ole Miss game, I think they might be favored in every game. We don't know how Alabama's going to look to that point, but I'm assuming they would have already lost to Georgia. So LSU might be favored in every single game besides Ole Miss. So they got a chance. There is not a single game here that I would say is unwinnable, which is unlike what I'm about to say for some other teams. So LSU has a really, really good shot here to make the college football playoff. And here's the summary here. LSU will inevitably drop off offensively. You can't help that when you lose that much talent, but they can still be a deadly pass game. Depending on how many of those top 3 games at home they can win, the playoffs could certainly be in reach. Moving on, flip the page here. Next up, we have Arizona. Now, I will admit off the bat, I am higher on Arizona than most people. Okay, this could be a really bad prediction down the line. Okay, because head coach left, starting running back left. They lost some talent to the NFL. But what I'm really betting on here is the connection between Noah Fafita and Teratoa McMillan. They won 10 games, okay, for the first time since 2014 last year. And they're trying to do something that they have not done in their 90-year school history, which is back-to-back 10-win seasons. The odds are stacked against them. With a new head coach, changing conferences, the circumstances are very wild, but I think they can do it. And I have them this high for a reason. Let's get into it. Here's what they were last season, okay? Offensively, they were a very pass heavy team. Okay. Fafita came on strong and they had multiple quarterbacks. That's the crazy. They had multiple quarterbacks last year. Jaden DeLora was the starter week 1, top 20 in points per game, top 20 in total yards per game. They didn't run the ball that effectively. Um, Nothing impressive in terms of turnovers or sacks per game allowed. Defensively, though, this is the thing that really interested me. Um, Arizona, in terms of Pac-12 defenses, outside of Utah, they might have been near like the best in the conference, maybe along with like UCLA and Oregon State. Because look at that, they're top 30 in rushing yards allowed, points per game allowed, sacks per game, which really surprised me. Only thing they really struggled in was passing yards allowed. They were top 50 in everything else. So Arizona, a sneakily good defensive team last year, which really shocked me. Let's take a look at their roster here, what they bring back. For some reason, our lads, which is where I get all this roster information from, does not like have this update at all. They don't even have Noah Fafita as the quarterback here, so I don't even know how accurate this is, to be honest with you. But let's take a look at what I know for a fact. Noah Fafita is one of the biggest X factors, in college football, and he could very easily be the Heisman when it's all said and done. Their new running back, Quali Conley, he comes from San Jose State. Okay, now listen to me. He had over 1,100 total yards and 9 touchdowns last season. Now they lost their starting running back to Washington. He left with the head coach Jed Fish, but they bring in their head coach from Fresno State, and this running back here, Quali Conley, he had a really, really good year at San Jose State. Now that makes me think if you're able to put up those type of numbers at San Jose State, imagine what you're going to do at a better school, better lineman, better blocking, better pass game. Like, I think Quali Conley could end up being one of the most slept on transfers in the country. So I have my eye on him. And we obviously know Teratoa McMillan. He is, I don't want to call him the front runner because Luther Burden is great too. But if they had odds on the Bolitnikoff, Teratoa McMillan might be right up there. Okay. So that's what I'm gonna say about him. Over 1,400 yards last season as a true sophomore, I believe. The man is an absolute monster, and he will be a top 10 pick next season. Mark my words. Uh, Defensively here, you would hope if you're Arizona that you can just maintain that same level. I don't think anybody was expecting them to be like a top 30 to 40 defense in the country last season. So if you can just get that back, I'm sure they'd take that any day of the week. Only one transfer, which leads me to believe that they're pretty confident in the guys that they got. So I'm gonna just is that DJ's brother? I believe it is Uyangalele. I'm gonna say they're pretty confident in their defensive unit, which leads me to be confident in it as well. And I do expect them to be more than solid defensively. Taking a look at their schedule here, looking at last season first, right? 8 of their last 9 think about what I'm about to say. 8 of their last 9 opponents were ranked at some point, right? And they won 7 out of those last 9 games. They went on an amazing streak there to end the season, which included wins against Oregon State, Utah, Oklahoma in the bowl game, albeit against Jackson Arnold and not Dylan Gabriel. But they finished on fire, and I do expect them to carry that into next season. Okay. Because looking at next season, they only play three. Actually, let's look back at last season. They didn't lose a single game by more than one score. They were in every single game they played. They played Washington extremely close. They played USC down to the wire. They barely lost that game in the Coliseum at in overtime. So even the games they lost, like they were either in or won every single game they played last season, which I love. Next season, only play three of my top 30. So it's a fairly easy schedule. And I do count that Colorado game as a close game because look how close Colorado played Arizona last season. That was a close game. So I would not sleep on that Arizona Colorado matchup. I think it'll be a great game. But their season really comes down to them and Utah have a very similar situation where their entire season comes down to this back to back game stretch here. For Utah, it was Arizona and Oklahoma State. And for Arizona, it's Utah and Kansas State. Unfortunately for Arizona, both of those games are on the road. How good is Arizona? I think the winner of Arizona Utah probably goes to the Big 12 championship game and meets Kansas. So that is a match. Week 4, that game could potentially decide the fate of the Big 12. So I'm going to have that shit circled. It is a massive game. Also, Kansas State in week 3, that will be the first test because going into that game at Kansas State, they will be boasting a what is that, a 9-game win streak here. So that is going to be their first test, really, in terms of potentially losing that winning streak. So those are the two games you got to circle there. But the good news is if you win one or even two of those games, the last 8 games are smooth sailing, especially their last 3 is just cleanup duty. Colorado, West Virginia, and at UCF, that's actually not a very easy stretch there. But Houston, TCU, Arizona State, if they're if they only have one loss or no losses by the time they get to Houston, that is, it's smooth sailing. You're coasting to the Big 12 championship game if you're Arizona. So I love that. So overall here, I do think Arizona is going to make the Big 12 championship game. And if I had to bet money, I think they're going to win the Big 12. That's why I have them above Kansas, above Utah, above all these other teams. I really believe in Arizona's offense to carry them all the way, and I do think as the Big 12 championship, or as the Big 12 champions, sorry, Noah Fafita and Terratoa McMillan will take Arizona to the college football playoff. That is my prediction. Moving on here. Michigan. Michigan all the way down at 11 here. A lot of people probably have an issue with that. Michigan, I don't know where to rank Michigan because they're raw. I look at the raw, I just use my eyes. But that's the thing, the eye test has failed me before. It failed me last year with Alabama, for example. But when I look at Michigan's offense, I say, yuck, PU, gross. It looks horrible on paper. But I think, listen, we all know what Michigan was able to do last season, and they deserve all the credit in the world for that. I'm not downplaying that at all, but people are giving them way too much praise for how good they think they're going to be next season. Okay. They are not a top 10 team. They are. And some people have them in the top 6, the top 8. Some people are just delusional with how good they think Michigan's going to be next year. They are not near a top 5, 6 team in the country. Let's get into what they were last season quickly. But here's okay, let's start with the defense, right? Because the defense was the story. Michigan was the best defense in the country and arguably the best I've seen. I mean, what are we comparing? We're comparing it to 2021 Georgia, right? That was Georgia's real great year defensively. Honestly, I'd have to compare the stats, but Michigan felt more dominant. Like to me, Michigan felt more physically imposing. They felt more suffocating. It feels like they made more big plays, like in terms of takeaways and stuff like that. Maybe that's just recency bias, but Michigan has a very good case of being the best defense I've ever seen. Okay. That's what we're talking about here. And that is the reason they won the national championship. Offensively, they did a couple things really well, mainly protecting the football, only 8 turnovers in 15 games. That's amazing. And taking advantage of the field position that their defense set them up in. Because Michigan got the best. If I had to bet, I'd say Michigan got the best field position in the country last season, right? That's why their points per game is significantly higher than their yards and all that. And they ran the ball extremely well situationally. They weren't top 20 in the country or anything like that. But when they needed to, Blake Corum was an amazing player last season for Michigan. So they did a couple things really well. But even this is the thing. Michigan last season, they had what, 7 to 8 NFL players on that offense, and they were middle of the pack statistically. That's the scare. Think about what I just said. Their quarterback, two receivers, their running back, a tight end, and two or three linemen all went to the NFL. And even with all of those guys, they were 81st in passing yards. They were 54th in rushing yards. They were 67th in total yards. What do you think they're going to be after losing their best players? Honestly, like it's delusional to me. I've seen people talking about it's business as usual in Michigan. I haven't even brought up the fact that they lost their coach, they lost their DC, they got a guy who's never coached a full season as the new head coach. I haven't even brought up any of those facts. I'm just showing you the fact that they weren't a good offense last year. And with all this change taking place, this negative, don't get it wrong, don't misconstrue it now. It's not like they're just shifting and reloading. This massive drop in talent. Are they supposed to go from middle of the pack to good after losing their most talented players? I don't believe that. It makes no logical sense to believe Michigan will be good offensively. I predict they'll be bad offensively. They were middle of the pack last year in terms of yardage. So here's what they're working with here. Okay, listen to me. Listen, please listen. When I look at this offense, okay, it is objectively no bias involved. I'm sure even Michigan fans would look at this and say, yeah, it's not that good of a roster offensively. But this is the thing. Michigan fans, they shouldn't care. You had an amazing season last. Nobody's expecting you to win 11 and 12 games and make the college football playoff. Some people are, and those people are stupid and should not be listened to. There are so many unfair expectations being lofted on Michigan. Look at this offense, guys. How many people could you even name on this offense besides Donovan Edwards? And I don't even, this is the thing about Donovan Edwards. You know, I do not think this guy is going to be a Heisman. He only averaged like 5, 6 yards per touch last season. So even if he does get all of Blake Corum's touches and he gets like 250 touches next season, I still don't even know if he's going to crack 13, 1,400 yards from scrimmage. He'll be their best player. He is going to be their best offensive player. Don't get me wrong. But it's not like he is going to single-handedly carry this offense like Blake Corum did at times last season. And defensively, they lost several of their best defensive players. Will Johnson returns. Um, uh, Kenneth Grant, Mason Graham, they return. Um, Derek Moore return. Like they got some good players. They got some really, really good players coming back. But in my opinion, you lost your best defensive players. You can't replace Tanner Still. You can't replace Junior Colson. Um, you lost your sack leader in Hero. So look, I think they can still be a top five. I think a top five defense is realistic. You can absolutely bully some of those garbage Big Ten teams you play. Absolutely. But the real question is, can they be the best defense in the country again? I don't think so. And I definitely don't think they're going to be good enough to carry a bad offense. Like the amount of time Michigan would have lost games last season. They would have lost to Maryland. They would have lost to Penn State. They would have lost to Alabama if their defense wasn't balling out like they were at times in the clutch last season. So I don't expect this you can't, lightning doesn't strike twice, as they say. Taking a look at their schedule, we know what they did last season, but here's the thing, right? Take a look at their last 6 games and notice how different it is from East Carolina to Purdue, right? Was a completely different team than it was from Penn State to Washington, because that's when the competent those last 6 games they all played against good teams, I think, and they struggled in damn near all those games except for Iowa and Washington. So I think that is going to be much more in those scores in the final 6 games are going to be what it's going to look like next season. It is not going to look like those first 9 games, So keep that in mind. Taking a look at next season, right? It's they play in terms of top level talent, it might be the toughest schedule in the country. I still think Oklahoma's is harder, but Michigan plays 3 teams where I'm just penciling in a loss. Like Texas, automatic loss. Oregon, automatic loss. Ohio State, automatic loss. Now they get Texas and Oregon at home, but honestly, man, Texas and Oregon are just so much better. I really don't see a way where Michigan wins. In the Ohio State game, listen, guys, Ohio State's roster is so much better. It's not even close. Like the amount of players that will be drafted from both of these rosters next season, Ohio State might have 3 to 4 times. Think about what I just said. 3 to 4 times as many NFL players on their roster than Michigan will next season. That is insane. And people will still say that Michigan should be favored in this game. They should be massive like I'm talking 6, 7, 8 point underdogs in that game. Because I think they already will have multiple losses. And I think Ohio State may be undefeated. If they have a loss, it'll be to Oregon. So listen, Michigan's schedule is so much tougher than it was last year. They don't play Penn State, but this is the thing. At Washington, you think at Washington is going to be easy? I don't think it's going to be extremely difficult. I don't know if Northwestern or Minnesota, I don't know if those are going to be easy games. USC, I think it will be easy, but it's like their schedule is so much more difficult than it was last year. I do not see a world where Michigan wins 10 games in the regular season. I think they'll go 9-3 and then win like a lesser bowl game. But no way is Michigan going 10-2. And I just don't see it. I simply will not believe that. So I don't really see a world where they make the playoff unless somehow they are able to beat Oregon, Texas, or Ohio State. But those are 3 of my top 5 teams in the country. I just don't think they can do it. They're not good enough. I have to see it to believe it. But this is the thing. They play Texas week 2. So it's not even they don't even get like a big warm-up period for they're automatically going to be 1-1. So it's like they don't even get a chance to really start off on a hot streak. They're going to automatically get their wings clipped in week 2. So I think they're not going to win 10 games. I don't think in any way in hell. I think they're going to finish fourth. I think they're going to finish fourth in the Big Ten. So here's the summary here. Michigan, they're being heavily overrated right now because of what they did last season. There is no way on God's green earth that they are a top 6 to 8 team in the country. The defense is the only thing, the only saving grace that is even keeping Michigan in my top 20. Okay. Because if they had a top 20 defense, they're probably like number 23, 24 for me in my top 30 poll. Because the offense is bad. The offense is objectively horrible. Okay. I need to see it to believe it that Michigan can score 20 points a game. Honestly. I'm not trying to be mean or anything. Moving on to another team that I think people are giving way too much credit to. This is the thing. I have been burned so badly. I don't even know where to start with Alabama. I was so wrong about them last season. It was incredible what they were able to accomplish with what I thought. And I think I was right. It was a subpar roster for Alabama standards, but they still went on an incredible, legendary run down the stretch. The real question here is how much did Nick Saban mean to the success of the team? It's a question we don't know the answer to yet. And can first-year head coach Kalen DeBoer, which I think was an amazing hire, can he somehow take this refugee camp of a team to the playoffs in his first season? Let's get to the stats here. And this is incredible because Alabama was not a good defense, or sorry, was not a good offense. Not a good offense. They were in the bottom 10 in sacks allowed per game. We're going to get into why, but it really comes down to their offensive line was so massively overrated going into last season that people were actually convinced that they were going to have some legendary offensive line which would carry them to the playoff. They were so wrong about that. The offensive line sucked. They won games in spite of how bad their offensive line was. Jalen Milroe saved this team. Without him, they're probably a 7, sorry, an 8 or a 9 win team if they start Ty Simpson or whatever the fuck the other guy's name was that went to play lacrosse. Their defense, it wasn't even a dominant Alabama defense. It was probably a top 15 defense in the country. I give them top 15, but it wasn't even some dominant top 5, top 10 Alabama defense. They were really good at certain things. They got after the quarterback a lot. They didn't allow a lot of points, but they didn't get, top 10 in takeaways. They weren't great against the run. Like this was one of the worst Alabama teams ever under the Nick Saban era, and they won 12 games. That's the mind-blowing part about Alabama last season. Let's take a look at their roster, the new look roster. Listen, I have so many concerns, but so many of the concerns I have right now are the same concerns I had last year. The wide receiver room was not good enough last year. This is the thing. The wide receiver core last year was historically bad for Alabama standards, right? Historically bad. And they lost their top two receivers. Isaiah Bond and Jermaine Burton are both at the door. So they have the scraps. My bad, my bad. You knew the mic was going to die at some point. It might die again. This is going to be a very long video. What was I saying though? They had the leftovers in terms of receivers, and it's even worse now this season. Um, their number two, sorry, their top two running backs are both gone. It was a it was a historically bad running back room at Alabama last season, and they lost their top two running backs. Uh, Isaiah, or sorry, Roydale Williams and Jace McClellan. They're both gone. They're both out the door. Um, the offensive line, like I said, massively overrated offensive line, and they lost J.C. Latham. Okay, he's out the door as well. I think they got the one guy. Who was his name? Caden Proctor. He returns, I guess, but he was bad himself last season, so I don't even know how good that is. The only, the only saving grace on this entire offense is Jalen Milrow, who is one of the most talented quarterbacks in the country, but just has no fucking help. Like it is actually sad, and he gets piled on so much it's crazy. You would think Jalen Milrow is a fucking bum with the amount of hate he gets for being the only competent player on Alabama's offense. Like it is crazy. And people are saying the same thing about Bryce. Bryce was the first to suffer from this lack of talent on Bama, but at least he had guys like Jameer Gibbs and shit. Fucking Jalen Milrow didn't even have a Jameer Gibbs. Alabama didn't have a single offensive weapon get drafted in the first two rounds. Jermaine Burton was like pick number 100. It's like they have just been steadily decreasing the amount of NFL receivers and running backs they've had on the roster. And look at right now, how be serious with yourselves. Look at their receivers, look at their tight ends, look at their running backs. Do you guys think any of these guys are going to be playing in the NFL next year? The answer is no. None of these guys will. And that's what Jalen Milrow is expected to win with next year. The only way Jalen Milrow takes this team to the playoffs is if he's just by far the best quarterback in the country. And it's so unfair to put those expectations on him. Can Kalen DeBoer bring another level out of Jalen Milrow? I hope so. I mean, the man had the old Notre Dame offensive coordinator with him last year, so that poor guy. But it's tough, man. He has to do the most while having the least to work with. It's so sad. It's one of the saddest situations in college football. But because he plays at Alabama, no excuses. You got to be the best of the best, or else you're a bum. It's so sad, man. And defensive, let's get into the defense here. The secondary has been absolutely decimated. Like I have no faith in it. They've lost so many players to the NFL over the last 2 years. They have nobody left. The only guy that I even recognize is Malachi Moore. They got three transfer players. Three transfer starters for Alabama in the secondary. Are you kidding me? And then the front seven, nobody. This is nobody in the front seven had more than 3 sacks last year. Where is the production going to come from? I don't think they're going to be a top 30 defense next year. I don't think they're going to be a top 30 defense or a top 20 offense. So how are they going to win games? That's the question for me. The only thing saving Alabama is that their name is Alabama. Like the defense is no longer dominant. The offense has no NFL weapons on it. They have Jalen Milrow and a head coach. That is all I'm basing this off of, is because I love their quarterback and I love their head coach. Without that, this wouldn't be in my top 25 team. This roster you're looking at is not even top 25 worthy. They have Jalen Milrow and Kalen DeBoer. That's it. Taking a look at the schedule. Obviously, their 11-game win streak was Nick Saban's final masterpiece. Okay. After the Texas loss, they were on a mission. Okay. They played four of my top 8 teams last season. Four, or not my top 8 team. They were played four of the top 8 teams in the country last season: Texas, Ole Miss, Georgia, and Michigan. They went 2-2 against those teams. They also beat the Heisman in Jaden Daniels. And Jalen Milrow did prove last season, absolutely proved last season, that he's one of the best quarterbacks in the country. Next season, it doesn't get much easier. They play 5 of my top 30, but the toughest games are at home, notably Missouri and Georgia. Okay. You get both of those games at home. You got Tennessee on the road. You got LSU on the road. You got Oklahoma on the road. But man, it's just not an easy schedule, man. Like even their out of conference games, like Wisconsin on the road at that. It's not an easy schedule at all, man. It's really tough for me to find how they're going to win 10 games. So I don't think they're going to win 10 games. Same thing with Michigan. Same thing with Michigan. I think they're going to go 9-3 in the regular season. I think they're going to miss the SEC championship game. And I think they're going to miss the college football playoff. You would have to win 10 games here, which would mean multiple upsets. They're not going to be favored at LSU. They're not going to be favored against Georgia. I don't think they're going to be. They might be favored against Oklahoma. They might be favored against Tennessee, but they need to pull off. They're not going to be favored against Missouri. They have to pull off multiple upsets to make the playoff. And I don't see it, man. I really don't. So first year is the most important year, and unfortunately for Kalen DeBoer, he has to follow up Nick Saban. It's not going to be easy. Difficult schedule. Historically, this is the worst roster I've ever seen at Alabama. Historically weak roster. It puts all the pressure on potential Heisman candidate Jalen Milroe. And let me be honest, if Jalen Milroe wins 10 games with this team, give him the Heisman. Honestly, give him the Heisman because he's their only hope. Next up, man, I need some water. This is going to be a long video. I still got 3 teams left. God. Next up, we got Penn State. Oh boy, let me tell you about Penn State. Oh, Penn State truly, and I mean this, I say this with all my heart. Penn State is truly one of the only teams I hate in college football. Them and Clemson, really. But Penn State is different from Clemson. Clemson, I just hate them because they annoy me. Like I've never liked Clemson or supported them. Penn State betrayed me. Penn State disappointed me last season, and they disappointed me so badly that I became a complete hater after the Michigan Ohio State losses. Drew Aller sucks. Let me say that again. Drew Aller sucks. Their wide receiver core doesn't exist. Manny Diaz in that defense last season is the only reason James Franklin has a job because the three biggest tests for Penn State last season. They failed all three. All three. If they would have pulled off any of those 3 games, people would have a completely different outlook on Penn State and James Franklin. But no, they lost all 3. Let's take a look at the stats. Starting with the defense, like we do for Michigan here, they were the second best in the country. If Michigan didn't exist, would have been the best defense in the country. Led the country in sacks per game. Led the country in rushing yards a lot, and that's like that number right there is even better. I think I think it's 10 yards per game better than Georgia's from 2021. They were second in the country only to Michigan in total yards per game. Top 10. They are the only team, I can say this with confidence, the only team that's top 12 in everything. Because I don't think Michigan was top 10 in, let me see. Michigan was not top 10 in everything. Michigan was not top 10 in sacks. They weren't even close to top 10 in sacks. Now they were top 5 in everything else, but Penn State, they were top 1 in sacks, top 12 in takeaways. But Michigan, that number's kind of skewed because they played so many more games than everybody else. So I don't even know about the takeaways thing, but Penn State, without a shadow of a doubt, was the second best defense in the country last season, and it kept them in so many games, man. But it was not enough because their offense, they had so many opportunities to win the Ohio State and Michigan games, and they just blew it again and again and again. The offense was pathetic. They couldn't throw the football. Their run game was the only saving grace here. Similar to Michigan, they were so high in points per game because their defense set them up in situations so favorable so many times when they weren't just scoring touchdowns defensively. Did not turn the ball over. Same with Michigan, only 8 turnovers. Didn't give up that many sacks. They were better offensively than Michigan, but still, like in the big games in crunch time, they just disappeared. Did Penn State? Let's take a look at their roster here. Where do I even start here? Listen, I say this with so much conviction and passion that Drew Aller is garbage. And I say that I was a believer. The first 5 to 6 weeks of last season, I was preaching Drew Aller, the best Penn State quarterback I ever seen. I called Drew Aller the best quarterback in the Big Ten. I wasn't too far off with that because the Big Ten sucked in terms of quarterback play. But I hyped up this man, Drew Aller, just for him to do nothing in the two biggest games of the season. Um, Listen, I have to see an entirely new player out of him in order to trust their pass game, and I just don't believe it. Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen still for the third straight year are arguably the best running back duo in the country. But the thing is, they showed me last year that didn't matter. They showed me that you can have Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton and not know how to use them and not get them involved and not be able to run the football. So it's like, what do I even do with that? They showed me they showed me in front of my own eyes that it doesn't matter that they have both those guys because they don't use them effectively in big games. So I have to take that with a grain of salt. And let me tell you something. Julian Fleming is their big addition in the transfer portal. Julian Fleming had 270 yards last season. This man is not saving their pass game. Penn State does not have a wide receiver on their roster who had 300 receiving yards last season. They don't have a single one. Tyler Warren had like 400 last season. Clap it up. That's their wide receiver one, Tyler Warren. This pass game is going to suck again. And I'm not looking forward to it. It's going to be a struggle to watch Penn State football whenever they play a good defense. Defensively, listen, they lost Manny Diaz, their defensive genius, their defensive guru. They lost a lot of key defensive players, Chop Robinson, Adissa Isaac, Johnny Dixon, Kalen King. They lost a lot of guys. Okay. Abdul Carter, he might be the best player on this entire team. He's the linebacker that's going to be converting to a strictly edge rusher next season. He's going to have to just do special things because, man, him, Kobe King, like it's not what it was. They lost a lot of guys, man. I don't expect it to be a top 5 defense next season, similar to Michigan. Really, Penn State and Michigan are really neck and neck for me. But here's the difference here. Let's get into the difference between these two teams. It's the schedule next season. Penn State's schedule is way more favorable than Michigan's is. Because Michigan, they have to play Texas out of conference, and they have to play Ohio State and Oregon. Penn State does not have a very difficult out of conference game, and they don't have to play Oregon. They only have to play Ohio State. So a much more workable schedule, I'd say, than Michigan. Let's turn the page here. Last season, like I said, pretty simple. They beat every single team they were supposed to beat by at least 2 scores. Very impressive, honestly. But the only 3 teams that mattered, the 3 games that defined your entire season, they lost all of those convincingly. Okay. 3 of those teams, though, and a little bit of credit to Penn State, or I guess, I don't know. Those 3 teams they lost to all were amazing, very good teams. I'll give them, I'll lay that on you for you to decide how you think about that. But next season, they only play 2. Only play 2 of my top 30. They get them both at home and they get them back to back. Okay. So I expect them to split with Ohio State and Washington, probably with Washington. So the first 7 games, I wouldn't call it a cakewalk. I think at West Virginia will be difficult. I think at USC could be difficult. At Wisconsin, certainly. UCLA, like they have some difficult games in there. And even their last 2 games, Minnesota and Maryland. Like, I don't know. Penn State took care of business as good as anybody in the country last season. Okay. But I don't know if I expect that to do that again next season with presumably a worse pass game and a worse defense. So I'm not sure how I feel about that. For example, the Indiana game last year, that wasn't easy. You know, the Illinois game was not easy, if not for their amazing defense. So I'm not sure how confident I am in Penn State in terms of taking care of business here. But, you know, 10 wins. Will 10 wins get you to the play? That's the question here. Can Penn State just win their regular 10 games and get to the playoff? I don't know. It depends on how big their win streak is at the end of the season. It depends on who they lose to. Like I think if they lose to like USC on the road and they lose to Ohio State, but they win their last 4, maybe. Maybe you can make the playoff. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how I feel about that. But here's the summary here. Their only hope is that Drew Aller in the passing game look competent. Okay. Because I doubt it. I just don't believe it's going to happen. But the real question, like I said, can I win 10 games This is the thing. Win 10 games, miss the Big Ten championship game per usual, but somehow make the college football playoff because it's extended to 12 teams. I hope not. I don't think they're going to deserve it. I don't think their offense is going to be good enough. I hope James Franklin gets fired because you cannot fail to win all of your big games and expect to keep your job. Like at the end of the day, for teams like Penn State, the only games that matter are the Ohio State games and making the playoff. And James Franklin cannot win those games. He cannot meet those achievements. And so I don't think he deserves to be the coach there. So that's how I feel about Penn State here. Moving on, this is going to be crazy here. And let me put it like this. This team I have next, I had them 3 spots lower. I had them below Penn State, I had them below Alabama, I had them below Michigan. But when I started to look at their team and their roster and their schedule, this is my new dark horse. This team I'm about to say right now is my dark horse to win the national championship. Let's get right into it. Miami. Miami, who had, I think, the second worst record of any team on this entire top 30, is my dark horse to win the national championship next season. Let's talk about it here. This is the make or break year for Mario Cristobal because on paper, Miami looks like an ACC championship winning team and a college football playoff contender on paper, of course. Taking a look at what they did last season, this is what impressed me here. I thought their offense was like the reason why they won so many games early on, but their defense was sneakily good. Top 20 in sacks per game, 11th in rushing yards allowed, top 25 in total yards allowed per game. They were top 56, which is a weird cutoff. They were top 60 in everything. So they didn't really have a glaring weakness defensively. And offensively, they were top 50 in everything besides turnovers. That's the big thing here, right? Is Miami turned it over too often. Think of the Georgia Tech game, for example. That we're going to talk about that later. But top 20 in terms of fewest sacks allowed, top 50 in everything in terms of points per game, yards, total yards, passing, rushing. Like this was a well-rounded team statistically, but they just didn't excel in enough areas, I think. But here's the thing. This new look roster, let's get into it. No matter how you slice it, Cam Ward is a massive upgrade over Tyler Veindeck. He has been one of the 10 to 12 best quarterbacks in the country at Washington State. And that was without a run game, a defense. Like he's been performing well consistently at a lower tier program. He has all the things now at Miami that he simply didn't have at Washington State. Damian Martinez had 2,354 yards and 16 touchdowns at Oregon State the last 2 years. He has a case to be one of the best running backs in the country. It doesn't say on here that he's transferred, but he has transferred to Miami. So, and even Mark Fletcher as a backup is one of the better backups in the country. He had 500 yards and 5 touchdowns himself last season on only like 100 carries. So I love their running back duo, but mainly Damian Martinez here. Martinez, Cam Moore. Let's get the receiver cord though. All three of Miami's receivers had at least 800 yards last season. Off the top of my head, I don't know if any other team in the country can say that. Miami has a case. Now, I don't know if they have one that's going to be like a first round NFL pick, for example. I don't know if they have anybody that's going to be like a top 10 pick, or whatever. But in terms of depth and just overall talent, Miami has a case for the best wide receiver core in the country. Xavier Restrepo had over 1,000 yards. Jacoby George had close to 1,000. Samuel Brown at Houston, of all places, had over 800 yards last season. Okay. Listen to me when I say this. This may be the most explosive and exciting offense in the country. In terms of quarterback, running back, and top 3 receivers, I cannot name a team that's better. Honestly, I say that wholeheartedly. They're just that good. And it's going to be extremely exciting here. And I think because of that, Cam Ward might be. I haven't picked this yet. Them in Kansas, but their receivers are so much better than Kansas. But Cam Ward might be my favorite for the Heisman right now. Right now, in terms of all the teams we've looked at so far, I'm thinking Cam Ward, Jalen Daniels, Noah Fafita, like Milrow, obviously, like in terms of the talent, though, the talent around Cam Ward on this offense is just amazing. And the offensive line was top 20 in terms of sacks allowed, or fewest sacks allowed. So it's like he has a better O line, a much, much better run game, even better receivers than what they had at Washington State, and on paper, a much better defense. Let's get to that defense. They bring in 5 new transfers, projected starters, to what was already, like I said, remember the stats. They were a top 30 defense already in the country. Tyler Barron comes in from Tennessee, and with him, you get 3 guys who had at least 6 sacks last year. 3 guys in their front seven: Tyler Barron, Ruben Bain, and Francisco Muyaga, or whatever his last name is. So you have 3 guys with over 6 sacks. A lot of teams don't even have one. So their front seven is going to be able to put a lot of pressure on opposing teams. They did lose both of their starting safeties, James Williams and Cam Kitchens. But listen, man, this is one of, if not the best, most well-rounded rosters in the entire country. And I say that confidently, okay? Like, it is that good. Like, it caught me by surprise, honestly. I was not expecting the receiving core to be this good. I wasn't expecting them to get Damian Martinez. Like, I'm excited, man. Miami is my dark horse. Let's get their schedule here. Last season, okay? It fell off a cliff after the Georgia Tech disaster. The Georgia Tech, if you don't know what happened, they chose to run the ball. They chose to run the ball instead of taking a knee. If Miami takes a knee, they win the game. For some reason, they did the forbidden tactic of not taking a knee, running the ball. Of course, they fumbled. And then defensively, they allowed Georgia Tech to drive down the field and score a touchdown in like 30 seconds or whatever. So, truly an all-time level disaster against Georgia Tech, and their season fell apart after that. They lost 6 out of their last 9. Okay, but here's the thing: it's a completely new team from last year to this year. But here's the thing: even in those few games they won, they beat Clemson, which is amazing for them, Texas A&M, and the MAC champions, Miami of Ohio. So you got some impressive wins in there. But here's what the thing: next season, they only play two of my top 30. You play them back to back. The first 6 games are a cakewalk. Honestly, guys, heading into Louisville, I expect Miami to be in my top 5, right? Because you think about all these other teams that are going to like lose ahead of them within the first 6 weeks. I expect Miami to be in my top 5 heading into Louisville. And it's not, listen, guys, Louisville's not a powerhouse here. Their quarterback might be hurt by then. They might have a loss or two. Who knows what Louisville's going to do? That's not the hardest game on the world. Then they get Florida State at home. That's the biggest game. That is Miami's biggest game of the season. Florida State at home. Can they pull it off? I expect them to. They should be heavy favorites in that game. Their last 4 games also: Wake Forest, Syracuse, Georgia, avenge their loss to Georgia Tech, and Duke. Those games don't scare me at all. That's a very easy. Their first 6 and their last 4. Listen, people love streaks, and they have the opportunity to pull off multiple, either a 7 or a 5 game win streak next season. Maybe both. They might go undefeated in the regular season. I could see it, honestly. So they are my pick to win the ACC and make the college football playoff. Here's the overall thing here. It seems like the stars have aligned for Miami to make a Texas-like resurgence. I mean, play so good last season that it gives people confidence that they have restored the Miami brand like long term. So not only do I think they're going to win the ACC championship, but I would not be shocked to see Miami win a playoff game or 2. And Miami may be my Washington next season. If you don't remember, I picked Washington before the season even started. I had them ranked way higher than everybody else did, and I projected them to make the college football playoff way earlier than everybody else did. And I think that's how I feel about Miami right now. I just look at Miami's roster, how exciting, how explosive they're going to be, and I just think I'm gonna attach myself to Miami right now. They're on my dark horse pick, like Washington was last season. So, man, I just love Miami's roster and how exciting it looks on paper, man. That's what it comes down to here. Next up, we have Notre Dame, man. I ran out of pages. I had to write on the fucking yellow part in between. This binder is full of college football shit. Okay, Notre Dame. They were such a letdown last season that honestly, it was hard for me to even believe in them going into next year. But with that being said, they made some more big additions via the transfer portal. And listen, the Notre Dame playoff hype is back, and it's back with a vengeance. So what were they last season? What did Notre Dame do very well last season? Well, they were a great scoring offense. They beat up on their easy opponents, right? They ran the ball very well, notably with Audric Estime, top 30 in the country in total yards per game. They did not give up many sacks, notably because of Joe Alt. Their offensive line was very dependable. They turned it over way too much, though. For a run heavy team with what was supposed to be just a game manager quarterback, they turned it over way too often. And defensively, this was certainly, in my opinion, a top 10 defense in the country last season. Third in passing yards allowed per game, seventh in points allowed, fifth in total yards allowed. They were not, I mean, they were top 50 in everything. They didn't get enough pressure, I think, to be considered like a top 5 defense in the country. But this was an amazing defense last season. And I think that is what's going to be their strength going into next season. So let's get into their roster here. We flip the page here, last page. Riley Leonard, he's the new top guy, right? He's the one everybody's talking about that they got out of the transfer portal. But, you know, what I actually like about him is I think the fit is going to make more sense than it did with Sam Hartman. I think a run heavy system should be prioritized. And I think Riley Leonard is going to be at the helm of that system. I think Jeremiah Love, Jadarian Price, they're going to be splitting the load. They're going to be, back and forth guys. But I think Riley Leonard is actually going to lead the team in rushing with like 700, 800 rushing yards next season. Um, I think Notre Dame, they're going to benefit from the experience they got. Guys like Jaden Thomas, Jaden Greathouse, Mitchell Evans, they weren't ready to be, top tier guys last season. But I think going into next season, all those guys are going to get better. And I think they're going to be able to produce more as a result. But Chris Mitchell, he's the guy. He is their big acquisition that they did not have last season. A true number one target for Riley Leonard. He had over 1,100 yards last season at FIU. He's the big time acquisition. Defensively, you got guys like RJ Oben, who should replace guys like Javante Jean Baptiste. He had like 5 sacks. He's been a consistent guy at Duke for a couple years now, so he should help them generate more of that pressure. And the back end, Xavier Watts and Benjamin Morrison are both potential All-American players in their secondary. Those are two amazing guys right there. So looking at their schedule here, what they did last season, all 3 of their losses did come against ranked teams. Okay, the Ohio State loss. I've talked about this loss for like damn near an hour on this channel at this point, but that game, it was in their hands so many times, but they blew it every single time. At every opportunity, they snatched defeat out of the jaws of victory, truly. So I do think that game just deflated them and took all of the wind out of their sails. They finished strong though. They won 5 out of their last 6, but they won 9 games last season by 20 plus points. That might be the most in the country. I'm not sure, but it probably is if I had to bet. Next season though, they only play 3 of my top 30. The toughest one being, of course, um, Florida State at home. But this is the thing about Notre Dame guys. They get 8. You're not seeing that wrong. They get 8 straight home games in the middle of their season, and they should be favored in every single game they play next year. That doesn't mean much. You can always get upset, but Notre Dame should be a heavy favorite in every single game they play next season. The final game at USC, honestly, that might be their bid for a playoff. Like if they have one loss going into that USC game, that's probably going to be for the playoffs. Like that game is going to have so many eyes on it for that reason. Like the schedule wise, like this is an easy 10-win season, right? I'm not overlooking teams here. Like A&M, that's a pretty big game, honestly. A&M, I think they're actually underdogs in that game, if I'm not mistaken. This was a couple weeks ago I checked, but I think they were like a 1-point dog against A&M on the road week 1. So that's actually a pretty massive game for them early on. But if they can pull that off, man, I'm seeing 11 wins here. I'm seeing 11 wins, 10 at the absolute worst. But listen, man, they might need 11 wins to make the playoff, but I think Notre Dame's offense will be better and more dependable, especially in the tough games. That's what they really need, right? They need a offense that they can trust when it gets, down and dirty. They have the playmakers that they didn't have last season on offense, and in their secondary, two of the best players in the entire country. Okay, an extremely workable schedule. They check all the boxes for a team that should make the playoffs and maybe even make some noise in the playoffs. I don't know how long that video was. It was probably long as shit here. We're almost done, man. We're almost done. Only 6 teams left. 30 through 7 have all been completed here. Oh, man. A lot of good teams, man. I really expect Notre Dame, Miami, and Arizona. I expect those 3 teams to all make the playoffs. And